Hi, everybody. Welcome to episode 7 of the Women's Power to Stop War webinar series, Men, Masculinities, and Militarism. My name is Emma Bergesser. I'm the International Coordinator of Women's Power to Stop War at WILPF. I'm really glad to see so many of you here. I'm going to quickly take you through some of the technical stuff for those of you that are unfamiliar with the webinar format and tell you a little bit about our series. And then I'm going to hand you over to Barbara Chojanowska to introduce the academic network and our academic for today. And then we'll hand you over to the lecture. All right, so on the technical issues, first to explain, you are all muted. That's okay, that's the format of the webinar. We also can't see your webcams, but there will be a time at the end where you can ask questions and we'll explain how that works then. If there are any issues, technical or otherwise, please ask that question by typing it in during the webinar. And if anything goes wrong, if, for example, you can't hear us, you can always try to quit the program and log in again using the same link you use now. And finally, we are recording this session like all of our other sessions, so that it can be placed online. So please keep that in mind when you do choose to ask a question. So to tell you a little about the series, the webinar series, the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom is the oldest and longest serving women's peace organization in the world. And we turn 100 years old next year. So we're celebrating that by starting a huge movement, Women's Power to Stop War, which the conference next year will be the place where hundreds of women peacemakers will come together from all over the world and celebrate ourselves as a movement, connect to each other, and strengthen our work together. And this series is leading up to those events happening in The Hague in April next year. Something special we have going on right now is the 16 days of activism against violence against women. The 16 days is a huge international campaign that starts on Tuesday, and we are getting ready to finalize a lot of our conference programming on the website ahead of the 16 days. We're also offering 16 days of discount for the conference tickets during these 16 days. So we hope for those of you that haven't registered yet that you make use of that. Finally, also, this webinar is a really timely one, of course, for what's going on tomorrow and the day after on the White Ribbon Campaign. It's the largest campaign involved on engaging men and boys to end violence against women and girls. And of course, ahead of that campaign, we are very happy to host this webinar today. So with that said, I'd like to hand you over to Barbara Chojanowska. Barbara, you can unmute yourself. Go ahead.
Yes, hi everyone. Welcome to this webinar hosted by the Academic Network of Women's International League for Peace and Freedom. As usually, I would like to start with a few words about the network for those of you who join us for the first time today. So the Academic Network is a global think tank that addresses issues of gender, peace, and security. And we have the aim to connect a global network of academics and peace activists. And in our network, we have university professors, PhD students, and independent researchers. And I would like to encourage you and invite you to visit our website because you can find there some information about each and every of our wonderful scholars. And if you've got any questions, please feel free to contact us. Just drop us an email. And we already hosted several webinars. Yes, and as you can see, we have covered a variety of topics, including the Women, Peace and Security agenda, disarmament, international law, sexual violence, political economy, or most recently, the issue of the state. And for your information, all of these webinars were recorded, so you can watch them anytime you'd like, and they are very interesting learning tools, so do it when you have time. And today our special speaker is Claire Duncanson. Claire is a lecturer in international relations at the University of Edinburgh in the UK. And her research interests lie at the intersection of international security, IR theory, and gender politics. And she applies new theoretical insights about feminism and more specifically about masculinities to current international issues. Last year, she published a book, Forces for Good, Military Masculinities and Peace Building in Afghanistan and Iraq. And I hope she will tell us more about the book in just 1 minute. And just to mention that prior to her academic career, she also worked for human rights and international development NGOs such as Amnesty International and Global Perspective. So, Claire, now you have the floor.
Go ahead, Claire, you're unmuted.
Okay. Thank you very much for that introduction. I'm delighted to be facilitating this WILPF webinar on men, masculinities and militarism. As feminists from the earliest days of WILPF right through to today have argued there's a connection between masculinities, militarism and war. So if we're to achieve peace, then challenging particularly the currently dominant models of masculinity has to be an important part of that project. So you already showed a slide that featured Cynthia Enlow, and she would be a member of WILPF's academic network who's been particularly prominent in arguing, along with maybe others like Cynthia Coburn, that we need to address the way that masculinism or patriarchy has causal in war as nationalism or the forces of neoliberal capitalism. And so we need to take masculinity more seriously when thinking about changing war. And that, of course, doesn't mean we take our eyes off nationalism or neoliberal capitalism, but that we need to pay attention to all three and how they interrelate when analysing and working to change war. So this webinar is focused on that issue. And here you can see on the slide the three main issues that I'm planning to talk about today. So the first I'll be quite brief on, because I think a lot of you might know some of this, but just interrogating what is the connection between masculinities and militarism. Secondly, moving on to thinking about masculinity as a concept, and is it a useful concept? And here I'll be drawing on feminist scholarship, but also the work of sociologist Raewyn Connell, whose concept of hegemonic masculinity has been so useful for thinking about these issues. But my main focus today is going to be on the issue of change. So this third question, how do we change, how do we challenge or transform violent, militaristic or misogynist masculinities? How do we theorize such change? And do we have any evidence of change, of shifting masculinities? And if so, the really crucial question, is there evidence of meaningful, substantial change that's bringing us further towards the goal of peace? Or is it more superficial? So if we move on to the next slide, Connell and many others have noted that throughout history, men have really predominated across the spectrum of violence, as she calls it. So these figures are current, and they make clear that this is still very much the case. Men still make up the majority of the world's armed forces, and they also make up the majority of non-armed state groups, paramilitaries as well. In many countries, all soldiers are men, and even in those countries where militaries are open to women, they're not often permitted to do all positions and therefore to rise to the highest ranks. Men also dominate in other branches of enforcement, such as police, prison guards, private security. And in private life too, men are more likely to be armed and violent. So gun ownership is, although it's falling, is about 3 times higher amongst men as it is women, with figures from the USA. And worldwide, 95% of homicide perpetrators are men. If we think about domestic violence, rape and sexual violence, it's overwhelmingly committed by men. And if we think about other types of violence, less obvious types of violence like contact sports, dangerous driving, again, they tend to be dominated by men. And Connell was also keen to point out that if we think about maybe structural violence too, so older men in their roles as corporate executives or as political leaders often make decisions that could be seen as violent, decisions that result in injury and death. So whether that be warlike foreign policies or industrial injuries, environmental destruction. So drawing on all this evidence that men predominate across the spectrum of violence, Connell has concluded that any strategy for peace must concern itself with this fact, the reasons for it, and the implications. But it raises this question of why. Why do men predominate across the spectrum of violence? And Connell was equally concerned to point out, along with most feminists, that there's nothing natural about men's violence. There's nothing inherent in men that predisposes them to violence or aggression. So the evidence pretty clearly shows that this idea of biological determinism, that your biology would determine your behaviour and that boys are just born more aggressive than girls, the evidence is pretty conclusive that this is just not credible. So, for example, the hormone testosterone, which is often cited in this regard, is a really interesting example because studies tend to show that actually testosterone varies dramatically amongst men and women, and that often it rises as a result of a confrontational experience or something like that. So testosterone is as much a consequence of social relations as it is a cause. And also, I suppose, if violence was biological, then surely all men would be aggressive. But as we know, they're not. So as Connell points out, almost all soldiers are men, but not all men are soldiers. Not most men are soldiers. And though most killers are men, most men do not kill or assault. So if not biologically determined, what does cause men to predominate across the spectrum of violence? Well, feminist scholars have argued that the main factor is the way that men and boys are socialized into thinking that being tough, being aggressive, being an authority, being in control are important markers of being a man. So it's this idea that proving yourself on the battlefield has been an important way to prove oneself a man. If we think about the cliches, militaries will make a man of you. It will turn boys into men. And of course, if we're thinking about how masculinities are part of the problem in perpetuating militarism and war, it's not just violence we're interested in, not just aggression, but it's the other aspects of masculinity are important. So the way that men are socialized into thinking that it's manly to protect the women and children in their lives, or that it's manly to take risks rather than play safe, to be active rather than passive, to be competitive rather than compromising. And these military ideals of manliness influence our definition of masculinity in broader society. So although Samuel Johnson's 18th century claim that every man thinks meanly of himself for not having been a soldier might be something of an overstatement today, we can still see remnants of that idea. So for example, a presidential candidate in the US, their military service is still deemed an issue. It's relevant. And if we think about films, books, television, series, and perhaps for those of us in states that are commemorating 100 years since the First World War at the moment, in these kind of Remembrance Day activities, we still see a valorization of the ideals that being tough, being uncompromising, is to be manly. Crucially, I think also, to different degrees and in different ways in different parts of the world, we still see children being brought up with those messages that boys are brave, boys don't cry, and boys need to protect their younger sisters. And if we just leap back a slide, sorry Emma, to those that doubt that violence and aggression are socially constructed, Cynthia Enlow points to the way that soldiers are trained in the military. So the slide you just saw that showed the kind of images you know well, I guess, from films and so on. And she made that point that if masculinity in the raw was sufficient, there'd been little need for the sweat, the blisters, and the humiliations of military training. And Joshua Goldstein concurs with this, arguing that if you talk to men who've experienced war, often they acknowledge that the reality is fear and confusion, and there's a lot of evidence to show that men actually find combat unnatural and horrible. And he makes that same point. Why else would you need conscription? Why else would you need the harsh discipline and training and rewards for battle and punishment for desertion? Okay. So in sum, many feminists have argued that there's this gender order which underpins militarism and war. So Emma, you can go forward a couple of slides here. Yep, and again. And yes, and as Peniston Bird has pointed out, that although today the distinction between the home and the battlefront is now arguably increasingly arbitrary, with civilians increasingly at risk and relatively few soldiers in actual combat, and the way that we've seen increasing numbers of women in militaries in certain countries, and also maybe the revolution in military affairs that has really disrupted how wars are fought, it's still the case that this identification at the symbolic level of the male as warrior and protector and the female as vulnerable and in need of protection have proved kind of resilient to reinterpretation. So these ideas that masculinity is achieved through toughness and endurance, aggression, and is authoritative, and is about protecting the weak and vulnerable, and is able to control emotions. Those ideas are still very much thought of as being the masculine ideals. And then femininity, by definition, because the two derive their meaning from one another, becomes associated with passivity and weakness and vulnerability and being emotional. Okay, but in some of these arguments about this elaborate gender ideology, I think we can detect a determinism that should make us a little bit uncomfortable. So, for example, claims in the last slide of Goldstein's that masculinity is an artificial status that's typically constructed around a culture's need for brave and disciplined soldiers. And he also writes the way that gender molding or toughening up of young boys happens from early childhood precisely because they may need to fight wars one day. While in some ways compelling, in some ways oversimplify what are much more complex processes of identity construction. Because can we really maintain that the entire gender order, everything that we think of as masculine and feminine, is the result of government in need to fill the ranks? It's to suggest a degree of power and state control that is perhaps unlikely. And it also perhaps denies agency to individuals who often enjoy what's known as doing gender, so living up to gender stereotypes, if you like. Male recruits are maybe more often active participants in the construction of masculinities than Goldstein's formulation implies. And other people, other recruits, as we know, are more often than not motivated to join militaries because of economic circumstances, that the lack of alternative economic opportunities is what makes them join up. And they might, some of them might actively resist these dominant ideas of masculinity. So this is all just to say that the connection between masculinities and militaries is a complex one, and we don't want to overstate the risks. I think there's a risk for us as feminists in emphasizing the mutually reinforcing links between masculinity and militarism, that war makes men and men make war, because we can end up reifying or solidifying the very gender dichotomies that we aim to challenge. And in any case, if we think about military masculinity, it's clear that there's not just one, but many. So if we flip forward to the next slide, and again, brilliant. Now this is just a sample of pictures of just one military. So this is just from the British military. So one small nation gives us an idea of the multiplicity of military masculinities. So there's the masculinity perhaps of the officer, so authoritative, well-educated, well-bred, commanding. The masculinity of, say, the infantry private soldier, which might be more associated with aggression, with violence. Then there's the masculinity of military doctors or military engineers, so associated there with skills with machinery and technology and mechanics. And you would say that they're all very different, but all recognizably masculine. And another thing that military sociologists and historians often point to when looking at military masculinities is a sense of contradiction right at the heart of military masculinities. So if you think about the archetype of masculinity, in many ways involves authority and dominance and power. And yet at the same time, soldiering often involves more subservience, more obedience, more deference to authority than almost any other profession a young man could be involved in. And also another example that feminists often point to, the attention to dress detail, the importance of having your uniform ironed, your boots polished, and your room tidy, are practices that are normally associated with femininity, that attention to looking good and being tidy. And yet in the military, they're demanded and respected and are seen as masculine. So this is all quite compelling stuff, I think. This idea that masculinities are multiple, that they're contradictory, that they're dynamic, they often change. But it leaves us feminists with something of a conundrum. Because we argue that masculinities are a key problem behind militarism and war, but this multiplicity and contradiction raises the question, well, is there anything meaningful about masculinity at all, if it can be so different? And if things that are almost diametrically opposed can both be considered masculinity, then is it a meaningful or useful concept? So Charlotte Hooper here on the slide makes this point. If the term masculinity has no stable ingredients, then why take the claims of feminists seriously at all? And this is where Connell's concept of hegemonic masculinity comes in. So Connell argues that masculinities are not merely multiple and equal, but that they exist in relations of hierarchy and dominated by a loosely coherent hegemonic form that she terms hegemonic masculinity. So if we flip to the next slide here, Emma, please. The term comes from the political theorist Antonio Gramsci, who argued that state power is often achieved excuse me, because people consent to it, citizens consent to it, so it's not always through power and force. And similarly, hegemonic masculinity dominates because the majority of men and women value this way of being a man. So even if the majority don't enact it, there's a sense in which men and women engage in practices that reinforce its dominance. So Connell was at pains to point out that it's not a personality type, but a set of practices, how men inhabit positions of power and wealth, and how they legitimate that dominance. And it's important to note that hegemonic masculinity is context dependent. So there's a picture here of Rambo, which might have at some point in place and time been seen to be the hegemonic masculinity. Everyone wants to be the tough guy. Women respect the tough guy. But the second picture here is what I would argue in the British context, and this is maybe true of other Western states' militaries as well. This is a picture of just a recent TV series that has been on in the UK, Captain James, who is from the officer class, so well educated, well bred, authoritative, commanding, but also he has proved his masculinity on the battlefield. He's an officer in the combat arms, as opposed to being back in the Ministry of Defence at a desk somewhere. So it's this combination, perhaps, of combat and that upper class commanding that could be said to be the hegemonic masculinity in the British case. So the concept of hegemonic masculinity is useful to feminists, I think, because it helps us to reconcile the multiple, dynamic, contradictory masculinities that empirical evidence shows us to be the case, with feminist insights into the connection between masculinity and militarism. So it helps us think through the way that this idea of the warrior masculinity or masculinities that are violent are not the only form of masculinities, but that they have a kind of, that they're a powerful model which through consent has dominated as one form of ideal man. If you flip back a slide, Emma, I'm not quite there yet. So the concept is a useful, thank you, is a useful one, and but it could be said to raise as many issues as it solves. And one issue would be, what purchase does it give us over military masculinities in non-Western contexts? So if we think about the male soldiers in, for example, the Democratic Republic of Congo, the ones interviewed by feminist scholars Maria Erickson-Baz and Maria Stern, masculinity is clearly at play there in explaining the male violence, including sexual violence and rape. Their interviewees definitely linked the idea of being a sexually potent fighter to being a man. But, as the authors make clear, these men can't really be considered powerful in global terms. Their masculinity is not hegemonic in the sense of commanding widespread respect. These men are as much the losers of global forces, including capitalism and militarism. And some would argue that in some ways they're violent because of an unfulfilled masculinity. So they're unable to follow or to pursue non-violent avenues to masculinity by, for example, being the provider of security or the breadwinner for their families. And that's, importantly, not to excuse their use of sexual or other violence, but it perhaps means that we need more concepts than hegemonic masculinity, or at least to complicate our understanding of the concept hegemonic masculinity. And Connell talks about marginalized masculinities as to describe the black and ethnic minority masculinities that are denied power in the hierarchy of masculinities. And Erickson, Baz and Stern talk about precarious or unfulfilled masculinities. And there's Hannah Wright in a new publication by Safer World, which has just been published and which I'd really recommend on this issue, talks about thwarted masculinities. And she brings in contexts such as Uganda and Somalia, where there's this idea that denied of non-violent ways of achieving respect and masculinity is one of the key explanators in conflict. But for now, I'm going to concentrate on those hegemonic masculinities which operate at the global level or in these kind of powerful Western states. That's the context I know a bit more about. And here I'd say another slightly different problem with hegemonic masculinity reveals itself. Because if you look at the definition here, the middle definition on the slide, if hegemonic masculinity is the way in which particular groups of men inhabit positions of power and wealth, then can there ever be change which challenges the power of hegemonic masculinity? So if it is defined as being the ability to inhabit positions of power, then the implication is that its power can never be challenged. So this definition implies that the particular practices and traits of the culturally idealized model might change, but that there will always be a hegemonic model, the enactment of which will only ever be available to elite groups of men. And this is perhaps best explained by way of an example. So Emma, if you can move us to the next slide, please. This would be the way that the hegemonic masculinity of powerful Western militaries might be said to have shifted over the last few decades. So since Western militaries, arguably since the end of the Cold War, have started to focus increasingly on operations which might be described as humanitarian, peace building or stabilization operations, they have also downsized, modernized and increased their professionalism, all of which has implications for the masculinities, the ideal form of military masculinity within. So some of these pictures here illustrate this idea about the new modern soldier is as much as skilled in building relationships, delivering humanitarian aid, escorting children to school, negotiating ceasefires and communicating across cultural divides. So the new hegemonic masculinity is arguably one which is as skilled as all these things as they are with fighting. And what's interesting about that is a lot of these skills are ones that have traditionally been associated with women and femininity, about caring and about communication. So Lali Khalili, for example, terms this new breed of soldier in the US context, operating in Afghanistan and Iraq, as the humanitarian soldier scholar. So she would describes them as intelligent strategists who aim to win the hearts and minds of the civilian population. So it's about wielding smart power, brain as well as brawn. And Sandra Whitworth and Shireen Razak several years ago studied the Canadian example. So the way in which Canada constructed an identity for itself as a peace-building nation, with its soldiers believing themselves to be benevolent, to be altruistic, humanitarians in their operation in Somalia. So in these cases, however, crucially, the authors caution to be wary of ascribing progress to these developments, to these new masculinities, because they argue, and Emma, if you can flip us on to the next slide, please, they argue that when you consider how these tough and tender humanitarian soldier scholars are constructed, how they establish their hegemony, we see that it's through the subordination of others. So identities are always relational. So the case here is the civilized masculinity of the humanitarian soldier is constructed through either implicit or explicit comparison with those in lands of conflict. So it's either a very feminizing discourse of these people in far-flung lands are backward and primitive and always infighting and need to be saved from themselves, or there's a trend of hyper-masculinization of those in conflict. So they're excessively violent, barbaric warriors, the dangerous brown men, as described by Bhattacharya. So as such, it seems that any softer, kinder, progressive masculinities always appear to depend on new race or class oppressions. The reason that these masculinities are so problematic, many feminists argue, is that this discourse, as Shireen Razak calls it, this discourse of this powerful and seductive story of the West bringing human rights and democracy to non-Western countries, distracts from the root causes of conflicts, which can be found firstly in the legacies of colonialism, of Cold War superpower conflicts, including the dumping of surplus armaments in huge swathes of the global South, and secondly, the neoliberal economic policies that have dominated the global political economy since the 1980s. So it seems that no matter how hegemonic masculinities change, hierarchical gendered relations, both material and symbolic, remain. Although those at the pinnacle of this hierarchy of masculinities might change their ways to a limited degree, and some different men and women might rise to the top, there doesn't seem to be much dent in militarism. And indeed, such shifts have been argued by some to be particularly ominous because they act as a smokescreen, if you like, making us believe that masculinities are shifting in a progressive, less violent direction. And as a result, diverting our attention from continuing to campaign for more change. I think it's important to ask at this point, is the problem that it's impossible to transform masculinities? That there will always be these hierarchies with masculinities privileged over femininities? Or is the problem more to do with the concept, which makes us see any shift in masculinities as elite men changing their ways only in order to retain power? As Lali Khalili puts it, the flexibility of the machinery of rule. So, in other words, is the problem the world that we live in, or the concepts that we're using to try and understand it? And I think that I don't think the problem is masculinities, that it's impossible to transform masculinities. I think the problem lies more with the concept of hegemonic masculinity, or more precisely the way in which it's often interpreted. So what I want to do is argue for a concept of an interpretation of hegemonic masculinity, which enables it to capture the persistence or the stickiness of the gender order, but which doesn't imply the inevitability of masculine dominance. And I think that's what Connell argues for too. If you look at this slide, she's always consistently been clear that hegemony may fail. Okay, so here she talks about the possibility of establishing as hegemonic amongst men a version of hegemony open to equality of women. Okay, so there's the possibility of a thoroughly positive hegemonic masculinity. Now, I'm not so sure about this particular formulation, because if we recall the means by which hegemonic masculinity achieved its hegemonic status, i.e. through the feminization of other groups of men, it's hard to see how a masculinity that is open to relations of equality with women could ever be hegemonic. But I agree with the overall point that hegemony may fail. I think what is more possible is that a contradictory masculinity, the likes of which we've just talked about with the humanitarian soldier scholar, this kind of contradictory masculinity could become hegemonic. And then it's kind of, if that's the case, these contradictions can be pushed at to try and ensure that such softer masculinities are constructed through relations of equality, through relations of respect, instead of through relations of subordinating those others. Then that could be part of a project of more transformational change. So why does this matter? Why would you quibble over the exact kind of formulation of change? I think it matters because I think sometimes we're too quick to dismiss these new, softer forms of masculinity. We're too quick to assume that they are disguising the co-option of feminism. It's maybe worth taking them more seriously as steps on the route to more transformative change. So I think we do have some evidence not much, it has to be acknowledged, but some evidence of soldiers who are not only adopting the non-violent practices and focusing on delivery of aid, communication, negotiating ceasefires, but also doing so in a way that is respectful of others, that tries to construct relations of equality and respect with people in areas of conflict. So in my work on British soldiers, which Barbara mentioned in the introduction, I argue that there is some evidence of, for example, British soldiers in the Balkans who weren't just delivering aid to women's groups, but took women's groups seriously as partners, subverted the stereotypes of them as passive victims. And also examples of British soldiers in Iraq and Afghanistan who didn't just provide security for Iraqi or Afghan civilians, but tried to work in partnership, who empathized and respected different Iraqi and Afghan people. And in such cases, I think there's a change in relations, not just practices. And that seems to me to be particularly crucial if we're hoping to transform masculinities. But as I've said, it has to be acknowledged those examples are few and far between, and far overshadowed by the evidence of soldiers doing the same thing that Sandra Whitworth and Lali Kamili point to, of constructing their own identity as benevolent soldier through the subordination of others. And of course, transforming hegemonic masculinity can only ever be part of transformational change. Because the main problem with this narrative of the humanitarian soldiers bringing human rights and democracy to zones of conflict, as we've seen, is that it distracts attention from the structural roots of conflict. So it's really crucial, I think, to try and tackle the neoliberal economic policies that exacerbate poverty and inequalities and make life impossibly hard for people, for ordinary people across the world, but particularly in conflict contexts. So that means ensuring that any peace-building intervention focuses on the economic rights and economic empowerment of women and other marginalised groups. Okay, and so that might mean that peace-building interventions provide economic opportunities and sustainable livelihoods for women, as well as quotas to enter national parliaments, for example. And this links us back to the problem we mentioned before about masculinities which are violent but not necessarily hegemonic in global terms. And Emma, if you can move us on a slide here, this question of how do you transform marginalised or thwarted masculinities? And here it seems crucially important that likewise we focus on the material as much as the ideological. So an example might be in areas of Uganda and South Sudan, cattle raiding is often seen as a marker of masculinity. So owning a gun, taking part in a cattle raid is often seen as, for adolescents, as an important rite of passage. Also, young men might need cattle as a bride price in order to marry, and it's marriage that is seen as the marker of becoming a man. But in such societies, cattle raids are proving increasingly deadly, in part due to increased food scarcity, in part due to the spread of small arms, and cycles of revenge that then are set in motion. And the Safer World report, Hannah Wright's Safer World report I've mentioned already, is very interesting because it makes clear that in order to challenge this negative cycle and to challenge these particular thwarted masculinities, it's really important to focus both on the material and the ideological. So by that I mean the need for alternative livelihoods, and as well as ideological work focused on decoupling violence from masculinity. Because, as she points out, if you provide alternative livelihoods alone, so for example, encouraging pastoral farming as opposed to cattle raiding, there's evidence that men can really resist this because they see pastoral farming as emasculating. And if you focus on ideas about gender alone, men can be penalised. You know, in contexts where there are no alternative means of an income, then men can end up poorer than they were if they weren't cattle raiding. And they also risk being perceived as the enemies of those who are continuing to cattle raid, and so they become particularly vulnerable. So as Hannah concludes, you know, it's important that changing men and women's attitudes towards masculinity doesn't become a therapeutic tool, and that doesn't pay attention to the material injustices that are at the root of some masculine violent practices. So if we move up us on to the final slide, please, Emma. I'd say that overall this feminist research generates several principles on how to transform masculinities as an important part of a strategy for peace. It's fair to say that evidence of what actually works on the ground is very hard to come by, because formal peace processes have not prioritised work on unravelling masculinities, transforming masculinities. And the Safer World report that I've mentioned has a fantastic review of the different strategies, so I would very much recommend that. And here I'll draw on some of their insights, but my focus, I suppose, is at a more general a level of more general principles based on the research into men and masculinities that I've outlined today. So the first point is this one that I've stressed about the importance of focusing on the relational aspect of masculinities. So as well as new practices, as non-violent practices that you would want to encourage, it's equally important that attention is paid to issues of gender equality. So that will mean, in some instances, men addressing the power they have and the power that they need to give up in order for equality to be achieved. And this links to the second point, that we need to pay attention to the way that masculinities always intersect with other vectors of identity, and the way that these other vectors of identity might be mobilized in order to create new subordinate others in any creation of new masculinities. So we need to work on ensuring there's respect for multiple ways of being a man. We need to work toward more fluid and shifting gender identities, rather than there being an ideal way of being a man. And I think an important shift in this regard is to get men to participate more in caring. So that's partly in private life, caring for their own children or immediate family, but also into the caring professions, so primary teaching, nursery nursing, nurses. I think that can seem limited and can seem like something that's been suggested so many times before, but I think it can have a transformative effect over the long term, because the key thing about it is, in these caring roles, it's not just practices that change, it's relations. It's the relations through which identities are constructed. And then thirdly, it's really crucial to focus on the institutional level as well as the individual level. So as we've seen, gender isn't just the individual men and women's ideas and beliefs. It's also very much embedded in structures and institutions that reinforce, facilitate, and uphold it. So ideas around what it means to be a man are reinforced by the law, employment law, family law, and so on. They're reinforced by education systems, these ideas about what's appropriate behaviour for boys and girls, and they're reinforced by militaries, as we've seen, religious and cultural institutions, to name but a few. So there's a need to work not just with individuals and communities about individual ideas of gender, but also to challenge those structures. So here, as well as education reform and legal reform, security sector reform and programs, DDR programs, which are areas where we're increasingly seeing good work being done to address violent masculinities. These are all crucially important. And most importantly, as I think I've argued, is to retain a focus on the material as well as the ideological. Because there's little gain to be had by masculinities being redefined in less violent ways if power and wealth and respect and opportunities stay in the hands of the elite few. So peace processes need to ensure that women and men have opportunities for decent livelihoods, and that this work goes along with ideas about appropriate gender roles. I mean, more broadly, it means we need alternatives to the neoliberal model, but that offering sustainable livelihoods can be a step in that direction. So none of those things are easy, and of course they're all quite difficult. But it's important to recognise that men have many motivations for challenging the currently dominant models of masculinity. And Connell points to just four, the first being that men have a relational interest in change. They have a relational interest in gender equality because men are often fathers, brothers, sons, and so on. Men may wish to avoid the toxic effects of currently dominant models of masculinity. So in the West, that might be that alcohol abuse or premature deaths due to violence or the reluctance to seek medical help. And in areas of conflict, it might be the fact that men and boys are far more at risk of death in conflict and also being recruited by force into armed groups. Thirdly, men might see the gains, the advantages for the communities in which they live if they are less violent. And fourthly, a desire for gender equality might follow from a general political belief in equality and an alignment with general political or ethical beliefs. So I hope that has given lots of food for thought, and I'm really looking forward to any questions that any of you might have and to anything you want to discuss. And that's it from me.
All right, thank you very much. That was incredibly interesting. So we'll now open the floor for discussion, questions, and comments. If you have a question, there are two ways you could raise it. Either you click on the button with your hand, and then we'll see your hand raised and we'll give you the floor. Or you can also type in your questions on your control panel under questions, and we'll read your question out loud. So we'll give you a little time to do that. I see some already coming in. In the meantime, maybe we can start with a question from me. So from the perspective of a practitioner in the women's peace movement, what do you think our role is as feminists, as women, to transforming these masculinities? Is this a role for men? What can we do as feminists? Maybe you can address that first, and then we'll take in other questions.
Okay, thanks for that, Barbara. That's a big question, and I've tried to outline as I said, the general principles. On a practical level, there's many different things, again, at different levels. So the Safer Worlds publication I mentioned has got lots of examples of projects at community level that are being done and can be done with men, different groups of men. So it might be combatants, or it might be civilian men. It might be men who identify as peace builders but who haven't yet adopted a gendered perspective. And that all seems to me to be very important work. The other work that I talked about in terms of the importance of working at the institutional level, I think is something that feminists already are and can do more. So it's about legal reform and educational reform and security sector reform, making sure that there's always a drive towards gender equality in these areas. And I think my point about involving men to be more involved in caring roles is something we can all do with the men in our lives, whether they're fathers, brothers, sons, partners, and so on. I do think that it's not a passe idea of second wave feminism, but something that has the potential to be more transformative. Does that answer?
Yes, thank you very much. So then I'll take a hand from Tamara Lawrence, and then I'll move on to some written questions. So Tamara, go ahead, you're unmuted.
I was trying to type this, sorry. So in your conclusion, you didn't seem to go back, in my opinion, to linking recommendations for addressing masculinity and militarism. And as a Canadian, I'm really concerned about the growing militarism that I see in Canada, in the United States, and now I'm living in the UK for 2 years, and it's global military spending is at an all-time high. Militarism is high in all these three countries, and you know, Western military foreign policy is so violent, and we have really got, as feminists, as peace activists, we have a real serious problem on our hands, and I'm wondering why there isn't more of a direct challenge of the institution of the military. I feel like as feminists we are tiptoeing around this too much. We're not confronting this head on and saying enough. I don't accept anymore the institution of the military. I want to see it abolished, and I wanted to challenge it more directly. So I'm just wondering if you can comment on that. And you talked about hegemonic masculinity. I'm wondering if you can also say something about, you know, the concept of hypermasculinity, and just link back to militarism and the institution of the military. Could you hear me?
Yes, yeah, thank you. I missed your name, but I heard the question. Yeah, I mean, I think you're right. I think that, okay, so two things. I think there is sometimes, particularly in the UK in recent years, and while the UK has been fighting in Afghanistan over the last 10 years, a reluctance that you've identified to tackle the military head on, because it's been very easy for the media to then to position such critiques as being anti our boys, our girls who are risking their lives. And so it's been much harder to have a head-on confrontation with the military. There's been, as you'll know, a real revitalization of glorification for men and women in the military, with the Help for Heroes campaign, which has for those of you not in the UK, has really become the charity of choice, and there's no way of criticising that. So I absolutely agree. I think there are two possible strategies. There is the head-on challenge to militaries as organisations, to military spending, to nuclear weapons on British soil, and WILPF isn't involved in that, and there are lots of promising campaigns in that regard. There's also perhaps what maybe my talk related to was, and maybe this wouldn't satisfy you, but a feeling that we're not going to abolish the military. So why not try to capitalise on the shifts that you could perhaps see in some Western militaries, where so far maybe it's only rhetorical, this idea that we're shifting to become forces for good, where our main aim is to try and achieve peace and security around the world, and to try and hold them to that rhetoric and say, okay, maybe it's primarily rhetoric at the moment, but how could it be made real? And actually I think you can pursue both strategies at the same time. You asked also about hypermasculinity, and as I understand it, that's often relevant in the sense that British and other Western powers now construct their masculinity in relation to hypermasculinity, which belongs to other men. And often this is where race comes into play. It belongs to Muslim men, it belongs to African men, not to British men. And that's particularly problematic and something which needs to be tackled. But I'm not sure, is that what your question was getting at?
So Tamara added typing that militarized masculinity is also highly manipulated. She wanted to add that. I think you did answer her question. Thank you, Claire. I'll take some of the questions that are typed now. Perhaps we'll take a few. Let me know, Claire, if you want to be reminded then. So first we have from Rabia Wakar, sorry if I'm mispronouncing your name. Do we have practical examples of transforming the existing hegemonic masculinities to be more egalitarian ones? So that's one. Then from Robin Lloyd, what alternatives to the neoliberal model would you propose? And third, Elizabeth Christensen from Norway, thanks you. And she asks, we need to have some easy flags to look for when meeting this in society. Any suggestions? Question mark. So go ahead, Claire. I'll let you try to tackle some of those.
Can you repeat the last one, please, Barbara?
Yeah. She writes, we need to have some easy flags to look for when meeting this in society. If you have any suggestions. Elizabeth, perhaps you can type in an explanation of what you mean by that while we tackle the first two questions.
Thank you. Okay, so I mentioned in my talk some examples of where hegemonic masculinity has perhaps been transformed. But as I said, it's, they're hard to come by. It doesn't seem to me that there are a huge number of examples, but so the ones I mentioned in the talk were examples of where soldiers in a peacekeeping context are building relationships with the local communities they're trying to help. So they're not only conducting practices which are non-violent, but they're building relationships of empathy, respect, equality. And I think we can see that in our day-to-day lives as well, that often there are examples of men who build relations of equality with women. So that would be my examples there. Alternatives to neoliberalism. Okay, so I think that it's not that market economics as a whole needs to be disbanded, but it's the particular forms of global neoliberalism being imported or being exported to societies emerging from conflict that's so problematic. It's kind of the subject of a whole other talk. But in situations of post-conflict, I would argue for economies that allowed some form of protectionism, for countries to be able to use their natural resources, to increase their tax base, to increase their spending on health and education before being asked to lower taxes in order to encourage inward investment, to join the trade liberalisation route, because it seems to me that only exacerbates inequalities and poverty. But as I say, that would need an hour in itself to talk through these kind of alternative economies. But maybe that answer is a start. And Barbara, did we have a clarification of the flags question?
Yes, Elizabeth just wrote some more. She's saying in discussing this topic, it's important to have an quote-unquote easy answer when dealing with this. These days, everybody is looking for the military to resolve problems, but aggression is not the solution. Elizabeth, I see you've also raised your hand, so I'm going to unmute you just if you'd like to say anything else. Go ahead, you're unmuted now.
Hi, Emma. Hi, Claire. I'm just looking, because you have some very tough explanations of where in our sort of language you do have the fact that men decide, or older men decide, where masculinity lies, and like you say, usually in a power structure. And we have a militarization going on in Norway and everywhere with Putin, IS. We are always, and now we are told, oh, it's so good we have the military because now we need to use it. And we do need to sort of figure out some sentences to meet this argument with, because the violence do not solve the trouble. Because if you fight Putin, they will show up some other idiot. You know, if you fight IS, you will meet their grandchildren in 40 years' time, because they will revenge what we did and are doing in the Middle East. So, and this is not something that you could actually start to talk to people about, but you need some sort of punchlines to just say, this is ridiculous, we have to evolve. We live in a very small planet, and the aggression that men have been allowed to show, there's no room for it. Thank you.
Thank you. Can you still hear me okay?
Go ahead.
Yeah. So I think in part what you're saying is the concepts I've talked about today aren't so useful as the slogans that we need some snappy messages, and I'd agree, but that wasn't my purpose today. And in terms of the kind of more fundamental issues, it's very difficult in a world where states have for so long focused on sort of zero-sum games, competitive approaches. It's very difficult to encourage solutions that are more about compromise and empathy and seeing the other person's point of view. But it's possible, and in that regard, there's maybe some encouraging things around the fact that the UN Security Council now, there's more ambassadors who are women who are on record as saying, this is what we think we bring to the table. We look for, we collectively look for solutions. We're more interested in collaborating than competing. And so, that's maybe one place to look for positive alternative models of doing foreign policy, if you like.
All right. Then we have Francine from Manchester.
Yeah, still there.
Okay, then we have Francine. Let me unmute you. Go ahead, Francine.
Hi, it's Francine here. I'm just asking what Claire said. I come from Congo. I'm from the Congo, and I know what's going on in the Congo. So I am talking in terms of culture. We African people, we have some kind of culture where women are being labeled like being the second best. They have to be on the women and the men. So my question is, what can we do to change that? Because as long the culture is there, we can't change anything. Women will be always there, like, and the men. You know what I mean? I don't know if you got my questions.
Yeah. So I think this is, the world over. There's no culture in which women are valued more than men. It's just manifests in different ways. But I think the key thing is to think about the way in which cultures are not static and they're not uniform. And there's always points of resistance, aren't there? And there's always campaigns for change. And it just is a bit of a long, hard slog in many ways. But the sorts of things I talked about changing it, pushing the state to change education systems and the law makes a big difference, and how you act in your own family makes a big difference. But there's no way in which it's easy. But I would dispute that there are some places in the world where the culture cannot be shifted because that culture is there. Because we all live in cultures that are persistent and sticky, but they are not immutable. They're not, but completely impervious to challenge and change.
All right, then we have a follow-up question from Rabia again, from her earlier question, I assume. Rabia, you're unmuted. Go ahead.
Hi, thanks. Okay, so I liked your response about, the like better relations that military men have in the countries that they're posted in. But I don't know. I mean, for me, it's a bit of a publicity gimmick or something. It's almost like co-opting the people who are actually there. I don't know. I mean, if a bunch of US military personnel are being nice to the locals for a little while, but then a few days later they go on a shooting spree and kill like 10 of the local people there, what does that matter? I mean, it just seems like you're kind of trying to justify your stay and trying to convince people that there's a soft side to you. I mean, I don't buy that. That to me isn't much. So I don't know. I mean, like a real example or like, I don't know. I mean, I guess it's tough with militaries. So thanks. That's my question.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, it's another good question. Yeah. Oh, can you still hear me?
Yeah.
Yes, sorry, I was saying another good question. I think that yeah, it has to be sustained building of relationships of equality. It can't be that superficial being nice to. And I suppose one of the reasons yeah, I mean, in general, I would say yes, Western militaries should intervene less. And any intervention that is 9/10 bombing campaign to 1/10 winning hearts and minds is problematic. So I wouldn't argue that Western forces in, say, Iraq or Afghanistan could claim on balance to be doing good. However, I do think there are some situations in which interventions can make a difference. And I do think that in such interventions, this sort of thing, building relationships with local people is really important. And part of what inspires that thought is work that Cynthia Coburn, who's also on the Academics Network, did in the Balkans in the early 90s, where in interviewing Bosnian women's organizations, she found that they quite often said, we really want military peacekeepers here, but we want them to change. We don't want them just acting, just doing the traditional military stuff. So it was a sort of a mixed demand for, they wanted a military presence because they saw that it was armed men in particular who could help do things like capture and arrest war criminals and demobilize and disarm belligerents from both sides. But they also wanted the soldiers to be people with whom they could work together, as partners in provision of aid or setting up schools or whatever. So it seems to me that in some limited contexts, militaries might be able to participate in building base. But I absolutely take your point that a kind of superficial building relations with the locals is probably doing more harm than good.
Great. Yes, Rabia just followed that up writing, I was just thinking of Bosnia myself. Thanks, I guess it's true. It's actually the same. We were thinking here at the office that, these lines about winning hearts and minds is probably more of a PR thing rather than enabling us to really talk about transformed militaries or transformed masculinities. I have a question here maybe to follow up on that from Megan. She writes, Claire, thank you so much for this really excellent and interesting overview of the subject. You have written about regendered militaries, drawing, I believe, from work done by Cynthia Coburn and others in Bosnia. Can you say more about this idea and whether any militaries seem to be making progress towards it?
Okay, so yeah, that question picks up on what I was just talking about with Cynthia Coburn's work with these Bosnian women's organizations, because that was the phrase that Cynthia and I can't remember her co-author, Hubic, wrote about. It was almost as if these Bosnian women's organizations were asking for a regendered notion of the soldier, because they didn't just, they were explicit about they wanted military peacekeepers, but they wanted more women peacekeepers, and they wanted so they wanted to see women represented, but they didn't want the male peacekeepers to be doing the disarming of belligerents, the arresting of war criminals, the cleaning of landmines, and the women peacekeepers to be doing the community outreach work. They wanted, or at least Coburn and Hubich say that what would be better would be a sort of regendered notion of the soldier, where you have both men and women partake in both those tasks, and more fluid and shifting gender identities. And do we see much evidence of that? As I've said in the talk, I think we do, but I think it is rare. I think perhaps maybe the Nordic militaries and are maybe our best example, but even there, it's by no means a case of them having cracked it. I think it's difficult to do, you know. It's difficult for structural reasons as well as individual reasons. Quite often, peacekeeping troops or intervening militaries are only in country for a short amount of time, and building relationships is a long, slow, hard journey. So I don't think we see many examples, but I think it is something that's worth thinking about as something to aspire to. But as I've said, not in every context, but in some contexts where local communities are asking for external support in building peace after conflict. And where it comes in combination with the sorts of things I was talking about in terms of economic rights and economic empowerment for local communities. So this kind of the economic pillar of peace building has to be prioritized as much as the security pillar. But thank you for your question.
All right, then we have a comment, two comments actually that are written, and then we'll go to two more oral questions. So Tamara writes, she actually asked if it's okay to share a link to the latest UN peacekeeping contribution ranking that shows that the Western militaries, particularly the US, the UK, and Canada, give so little humanitarian help. They are not even in the top 50 countries that contribute. What the Western militaries want to do is the war fighting for self-interested reasons. So we're happy to share that link with every participant of the webinar afterwards. So thanks, Tamara, for that. Katja Confortini, unfortunately, she had to leave, but she thanks you, Claire, for a great webinar. And Megan just wrote, yes, that does answer her question. So then to go to some oral questions, I have Mirko Fernandez. You are unmuted. Go ahead. You are unmuted. Go ahead.
Yeah, hi. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah, hi. Can you hear me? Okay, my question is for Claire. First of all, thank you very much, Claire, for its really interesting presentation. First of all, thank you very much, Claire, for its really interesting presentation. My Claire is regarding the role of religious groups.
Mirko, can I just interfere for a second? Could you please mute your microphone on your computer because we're hearing a big echo. Mute your microphone on your computer because we're hearing a big echo.
Yeah.
Mute your microphone on your computer because we're hearing
Yeah, can you hear me now? Is that better?
I'm not sure I can still hear you.
Sorry, it seems like we're not really able to hear you. Perhaps you can have a look at your microphone while we give someone else the floor and try you again in a few seconds. So we'll try Robin Lloyd. You are unmuted. Go ahead.
Yes, hello, thank you. Listen, I may have missed some parts of your responses because of technical difficulties, but it seems to me you have not referred to Security Council Resolution 1325, and I'm wondering about that, especially in terms of the question seen about the Congo, where and I guess this question is partly to Francine as well. Was the Security Council 5 applied there in some ways to give women at least a handle in which to deal with the issue of rape and violence of men against women, is there a justice system? I mean, women can appeal to the justice system in order to get some justice for what has happened. So I guess I'm just asking about that resolution and how effective it's been and whether it can be used more strongly.
Great, yeah, another good question. Yeah, I should have made more reference to it. I think, so Security Council Resolution 1325, it was passed in 2000, so coming up to the 15th anniversary. I think feminists research in the area, there was initial disappointment because it didn't make much reference to transforming men and masculinities in its earliest in the actual text. However, subsequent resolutions have, and also the way in which it's been translated into practice on the ground through national action plans and other things, feminists have been pushing to make sure that it does more to address men and masculinities. So I mentioned security sector reform and DDR programs as starting to engage with transforming masculinities as part of what they do, and that they have come about because of 1325 and subsequent resolutions. So I think it's been really important. So I hope that answers your question. In terms of the DRC, maybe Francine will come back on, but my understanding is that yes, it's definitely very much been used by women's organisations to try and push for change, but there are also, and there is a legal system and there are prosecutions, but it is very, very challenging. And not only does the legal and judicial system lack the resources to prosecute everyone, there's also an argument that, and I mentioned the Erickson, Baz and Stern book in my talk, but there's they, along with another of other scholars, point to the way in which, for some women in the DRC, we need to remember that rape and sexual violence is only one of the many human rights violations that they have experienced as a result of the war. And there's a risk of privileging sexual violence over economic livelihoods or other forms of redress that would help these women as much as seeing their perpetrator behind bars. So it's a really complicated issue, but I think that again, probably Barbara will be able to point to, on the WILPF website, to more resources that address this as well.
All right, then we have another oral question from Ilinka Diakonou. Perhaps, Mirko, that earlier question of yours, if you'd like to type it in, that might work as well. So, Ilinka, you're unmuted now. Go ahead.
Thank you very much for your presentation. My question regards what do you think about the tension between what Connell and Messerschmidt calls emphasized femininity and the internalization of negative hegemonic masculinity traits by the women who embody this emphasized femininity. So as an example, American white supremacist groups. So on the one hand, women in these white supremacist groups sort of internalize this kind of traditional view of femininity as a stay-at-home mom, that deals with, raising children and, being a partner for their husbands. But at the same time, they internalize this negative, violent, aggressive view of people of other races and sexualities and so on and so forth, and actually see themselves as creating men, boys and then later men who will uphold their principles. So basically my overarching question would be, isn't addressing hegemonic masculinity also about addressing certain types of femininities? And doesn't that complicate, just like Goldstein says in his book, that the relationship between women and peace and between men and war?
Okay, another good question. I think, yeah, very much so. The whole project of tackling violent or militaristic masculinities has to involve thinking about women and femininities as well. Because not just in the sort of extreme example that you've shared with us there, but in all sorts of examples, it's the hegemonic masculinity dominates through often the practices of so many women who endorse and respect that way of being a man. So yes, women need to think about their own gender practices and their own cultural ideals and question whether they are conducive for peace. And the second part of your question, so does this kind of complicate the gender ideology I talked about at the start? The kind of idea that masculinity is associated with violence and war and femininity associated with peace. And I think there's lots of, I think feminists have become quite adept at sort of strategic essentialism, at using the association of women with peace for our own ends to try and pursue peace in a way that avoids labeling, reinforcing the idea that we're naturally more peaceful and therefore maybe not to be taken seriously in public life. And I think that's the way to continue, and WILPF is a good example of that, this idea that there's nothing natural about, or not naturally peaceful about women, but because of the roles we've traditionally played in society, we're quite well practiced at compromise and caring and finding solutions to problems. And I think that, I don't know if that's what you were asking me actually, but it's something that I had wanted to bring into today, so thank you.
All right, then we have the written question from Mirko. He writes, in building sustainable relations with communities to promote peace, generate gender equality, and transform masculinities, including those inherent to security institutions, how do you see the role of religious groups? Are these opportunities or obstacles?
I'm not qualified to say. I don't know enough about that, and it's something I'm hesitating to give an answer because I don't know, but I'm sure other people will know the answer to that. I'm sure there will be good resources. It's not my particular area. Sorry, Mirko, that's a poor answer for you.
All right, maybe if anyone else wants to try to answer that question, I will move to some comments, some written comments. Elinka writes, thank you for your response. That answered the question. And in the meantime, Francine from DRC has replied to what you were saying earlier. She writes that the problem of the DRC is these negative masculinities. it's all about the power where women, where the problems of women are not taken into consideration until Congolese men change this idea of being the key to everything. Congolese women will continue to suffer. And another problem is a lack of leadership in the DRC. He also writes, thank you very much for your answer. This is why Congolese youth like me need to learn from other feminist groups. That's why I'm here, because this means so much to me as being a young Congolese. So thank you very much. That's from Francine. Do you want to comment on that, Claire?
Nothing really, except to say, stay in touch if you want. I think you said you were in Manchester, is that right? So, do. I think my email is Barbara. Is it available on the WILPF website, or you can pass it along, and we can stay in touch.
Right. All right. So this would be the time for any other questions, comments. We'll give you a few more minutes to raise your hand or type in a question. In the meantime, perhaps a last question from our side, as a really practical question for you, Claire. So I was wondering about the difference between trying to keep spaces just for women, where women, can talk to each other, can support each other, can grow the feminist movement and grow strong together, and when exactly would it be time for us to include men in that? And it's actually a really practical issue we've just recently come across when organizing the conference for next year. Now you can see on our website, Engaging Men and Boys, we've chosen it to be a really big part of the conference, and we are welcoming men and boys to be part of it. But that was actually a very long discussion inside WILPF, and we would be interested to hear your opinion about it, because at the time we had a lot of women here who were saying, we're still fighting for our spaces to just be women together, and others were saying it's time to invite men to the conversation. So that would be interesting to have your view on that.
Yes, I mean, it is just a very difficult question where you can see both sides so clearly. The value of women-only spaces, there's so much, there's a need for it, but I think the urgency of the task of combating militarism and war is such that we need the biggest movement we possibly can. So I suppose, while really respecting the views of those who would rather preserve a women-only space, I suppose I err slightly on the side of an inclusive approach, but being mindful of the risks that women often highlight, which is that when men are involved, does it change the style of decision making and the leadership and so on? But I think that we've got models now and ideas around men being allies of women's movements. There's a lot we can learn from movements against violence against women in domestic contexts, about how men can be allies in feminist campaigns for change. I'm always struck at, in my home city, in Edinburgh University, there is a feminist society, and the young men that are involved in that seem to me to be quite good examples of allies of feminists. So, but there's no easy answers to that question.
All right, thank you very much for that. Then I think we have a final question then. Actually, Francine first shared her email address with you, so we'll make sure that you can be in touch with each other. And then the final question from Julie. She writes, I agree with Francine. She's also from the DRC, lives in the USA, and is taking a course on women in politics, leadership, and public policy. She apologizes for being late, but what, in your opinion, could be the solution to eradicate wartime sexual violence? The UN has come with several resolutions and have introduced gender in all of their programs, but sexual violence against women in conflict still flourishes and impunity persists. Perhaps this is a really fitting question for the campaign, the 16 Days of Activism campaign coming up next week. Perhaps you can try, I know it's not exactly what the webinar focused on, but if you'd like to maybe try to answer that, and maybe any other final comments you'd have, and then we'll move to closing this webinar.
Okay. Well, I suppose one thing to highlight is you have had a webinar, haven't you? Was it Janie Leatherman who spoke on sexual violence in conflict, and so that's still available on the WILPF website, and I'd encourage people to look at that. It is there'll need to be a multi-pronged strategy to address it, and you point already to the UN Security Council resolutions, which, and I think some feminists have suggested that there's maybe a more of a push to tackling impunity. So although it needs to be better funded and better resourced, there is now increasing international attention to how do we tackle this impunity problem. So legal reform and judicial reform and more funding going into judiciaries and legal systems so as to be able to catch and prosecute perpetrators of sexual violence. But it needs to go beyond that, doesn't it? And you will know as much about this as me. It needs to also, we need to be looking at education, systems and private life to transform this idea that having power over women is a marker of masculinity. There needs to be, as I've mentioned quite a lot, more attention given to the economic pillar of peace building, of post-conflict reconstruction, so that, I talked a little bit about part of the explanation for wartime sexual violence is because some men feel there's no avenue to achieve a non-violent masculinity. There's no, there are no jobs, basically. There's no economic opportunities, and that exacerbates the situation. So that's maybe, it's not my area, so I'd encourage you to look at the other webinar, but it seems to me that we need to pay attention to all those strands, the legal, the economic, the justice are all important, and the educational in trying to tackle sexual violence and war. And I don't have any final comments, Barbara. That's you know, I think except to say thank you so much to everyone for all your questions, because they were really they really pushed my thinking, and were, you know, I suppose they really shown just, I'd already finished the talk by saying, you know, none of these challenges are easy, and I think that has been really made evident by the questions. But the fact that so many people did tune in to listen, and that we've had this debate, I suppose, is a sign that, you know, we're all thinking about these issues, and that is a positive sign. So thank you, Barbara.
All right, thank you so much, Claire, and thank you all for a really great discussion. I think this was really informative, and I hope we can keep the discussion going, especially at the conference next year, because like I just said, this really is a really big topic there. And yes, Claire was right that it actually was, sexual violence in conflict was a topic of an earlier webinar that we've covered, and all of them are online for you to watch as well if you like. So with that, I'm going to move to give Barbara the floor to close this webinar, and thank you all again. Bye.
Yes, thank you very much, Claire, for this excellent and very insightful presentation. And from my side, thank you especially for showing us that the connection between masculinity and militarism is a complex one, and this is actually where there is some room for transformation of violent masculinities. So thank you for that. And thank you all for participating and for the really good discussion. You can see our contact details on the slide now, so in case you have any questions about the academic network or about the 2015 International Conference of WILPF, please just send us an email. Thank you.